Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in Python programming. Today we're going to cover part 2 of a two-part series in Python programming where the topic of discussion is handling external files using Python programming. Now the objectives for today's lesson is as follows. First, we'll learn how to append and write data to an existing file. Next, we'll learn how to create files from scratch and write data to those new files. But first, let's take a moment to understand how these various operations work. With the append method, this allows us to add data to an external file where data already exists. Here is a basic example of how the append operation is carried out. We first open the file, target the specific file, then call the append operation denoted by the letter A. We store this as a variable f. Next, we simply call the write function, pass in a string, and the string will be written to the text file. Much like the append method, we can also write data to a specific file. The write method will overwrite any existing data in an external file. This is different from the append method in that any existing data will be removed and replaced with the new string when using the write method. Here is another basic example of using the write method. We open the file, specify the path, specify w as the write parameter, we save this as f, and then we simply call the write function on the f variable which we stored the file into. As a parameter, we add a string, and this string will replace any existing content within that file. In Python, we can also create a file from scratch if that file does not yet exist. We can achieve this with the write operation as well. Notice that when we create a file, the syntax is almost identical to that of writing to a file. We first open a file path, specify the file name. We then allocate the parameter w as the write parameter. We then write some string to the file, and then we can close that file if we do not specify the with keyword. How this works is that the write operation will create a new file and write the data to the file if the file does not exist. However, if the file does exist, as we've already specified before, any previous existing data in that file will be overwritten. Now it's that time of the lesson where we tackle yet another practical demonstration. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. Now to get started, I'll first create a new project. I'll point this to the existing folder structure, right click, create a new directory, and I'll name this lesson 5. Expand this, click OK, and then we want to make sure that we've selected our interpreter. I'll then go ahead and click create. I'll replace this existing window with a new window here, and then I'll simply delete all of the existing code. So let's briefly take a look at the files that we are going to be working with in this particular lesson. Inside of our file explorer, I will locate the project folder that we just created, and notice besides our NumPy file, we also have 2 additional text files over here. So file 1 just has some text which says this is some existing text. In the second instance, we have a file called Metcalfe's Law. So if we open this up, we just have a really long definition of what this law states. We'll come back to this later because we are going to do something very interesting with this specific file. Now heading back to our PyCharm environment, we'll start off with a very basic append operation. So I'll simply say with open, do the following. Select the file called file1, then perform the following operation. And that is going to be an operation of append, which is going to be our second parameter over here. I'll save this as file, and then I'll add my colon, and then next I'll call file dot write, and I'm going to include some text over here. So I'll use double quotation /n just to append this onto a new line, and then I'll say this is some new text which was appended. And now if we run this, we have a successful execution. Now let's head back to our Explorer and let's open up file 1 once again. You'll notice that I have a second line as a string over here. So essentially what we've done was we've appended additional data or text to this file using our Python program. Great. So next I'm going to close this file over here, maintain my file explorer, and let's try to overwrite the existing data in the file that we just opened up. So I'm going to change the operation from append to write by denoting the letter W over here. And I'm going to replace this with a completely different string, which basically says this text overwrites all existing data in the text file or in text file. Now let's head back into Explorer. And if we open this file once again, you'll notice the previous data, the previous two strings were replaced with this new string that we executed as a result of the write method or write operation. Now, what about creating a file that does not exist in our project folder over here? I'm going to close this down and I'm going to refactor the code we have here at the top. I'm going to change this from file_1 because we know this exists already. I'll change this to file_2. I'll maintain the write method or write operation, and then I'll simply write something out, and then I'll call file.close over here. Now we might want to include a completely different string just to indicate that the new file is being created. So instead of this, I'll simply paste in, this is a new file which was created using Python. Now I'm going to do something interesting over here, and I'm going to open up the File Explorer, and I'll minimize this slightly, drag this out to about there. And what I want you to take note of is that this file is going to be created in real time as we execute this code. So let's run this code and take note of the files that currently exist in this folder. If I run the code, we now have a new file called file2. And if I open this up, we have the expected message. This is a new file which was created using Python. This is quite useful in the event that you want to write something to a file, and if that file does not exist, but you want to be assured that the data will be exported to that specific file, well, then we can use this approach to create a file and add the data. Excellent. So let's close all of this down. I'll minimize my File Explorer, and we'll work on the next example. For this example, we are going to try something slightly different. I'm going to erase all the existing code and I'll paste a variable which has a list assigned to it. The variable is named fruit list, and inside of this list we have apple, orange, bananas, grapes, as well as peach. The idea behind this is to write this to a file that we'll create, which will then open and read the contents of that file. So to get started on a new line, I'll do with open, and then I'll pass in fruits.text.txt as my first parameter. My next parameter is going to be write, which will be W over here. And then I'll say as list underscore of fruits. Next, I'll add my colon. And on a new line, I'm going to start with a loop. Notice, once again, indentation is quite important over here. So I'll say for fruit variable in the fruit list, grab every single fruit, and then I'll call list of fruits dot write. I'll skip a line over here. So first we want to add quotation marks. So -n for a new line. I'll concatenate this with the fruit that we'll have in every iteration of the list. That is to say, we'll go through this entire list and print each of these out, or write each of these out into the list of fruits file that we are going to create. And on a new line, I'll double backspace so that we are against our gutter over here. And I'll create a variable called content, which is equal to the open function once again. And I'm going to open a specific file. The file I'm going to open here is the one that we've just created, the fruit.txt. So I'll open fruit.txt, and I simply want to read that content. So then I'll print content.read. And now if I open up my File Explorer once again, and I decrease the size of my IDE, notice that the new file is going to be created over here. So I'll click run. Notice that fruits has been created over here. These are the values that we've written to the fruits document, and then we've also read the values from that document. And that's how we can use lists in the event that we want to print multiple values from a list into an external file. Excellent. Now let's do one more example. I'm going to clean up all my code over here. Now for this next example, we are going to open up an existing file, we're going to access the contents of that file, and we're going to try and count each and every single word in that file and output the number of words within that specific text file. So let's get started. For this example, we are going to create a function. So I'm simply going to specify the define keyword. I'm going to call this function count words. And I'm going to pass in one parameter over here called file underscore path. And then I'll specify my colon. Next, I'm going to call with open the parameter file underscore path. So effectively what we are doing here is we are taking the parameter that we are going to pass in here and we're going to pass that into our open function as well as a file or as file. Then I'll create a new variable called data, set this equal to the file that we just created, and I'll call the .read function on this. Next, I will use that data variable I just created and call .replace, which requires two parameters. In this case, the first parameter will be a comma. The second parameter will be a empty set of strings. However, note that this is a space, where the space is the old string, which we are replacing with the new string, which is a comma in this case. On a new line, I'll simply return the length of an object. In this case, that's going to be data.split, which just allows you to specify the separator that you want to split. In this case, it's going to be the space. And on a new line, I'm going to call this function by printing the count words. So when I call count words within my print function, notice that my print statement is against the gut over here. So I'm no longer within the function body. What I'm going to do is call or invoke the words function, the count words function, by passing in a parameter, which is the file path, which is required by this open function over here. And that file is going to be met.txt, which is the text file inside of our project folder. If I open this up, we can actually see the contents of this file. Now let's run this code and we have an output of 27. So what exactly is happening here? All we are doing is we are handling this file by accessing the content and we are counting the number of words in that specific file. If you think about it logically, we've actually just built a very basic program similar to the word count option that you'll often find in Microsoft Word. And that brings us to the end of our two-part series in file handling with Python programming. In today's lesson, we learned how to append files. We also learned how to create files. We also learned how to write data to files, and we created a couple of interesting programs. In our next lesson, we're going to start learning all about SQL databases. Databases are an imperative part of any programming language. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.